Welcome, creative adventurers. I'm DKohn with DKohn Designs. I'm so glad you're here today. Welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to give you 4 things to consider when choosing a quilt backing. So perhaps you're about to start a quilt project, but you want to buy all your materials at the same time and you don't know what backing you should buy. Or you've just finished that quilt project and you did not buy the backing because you were still thinking about it. What quilt backing should I buy? Or you've got a stack of quilt tops because the thought of just buying the backing is a little bit intimidating. In this video, I'm going to give you 4 things to consider when purchasing or using quilt backing. I'll also give you a dozen fabric options, design tips for choosing the perfect backing fabric, and ideas for fabric sources. I hope you'll find these helpful. Let's get started. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up and tell a friend. Subscribe to my YouTube channel and click that notifications bell so you won't miss a thing. Please head on over to my blog at DKohn Designs, where you can find free patterns and lots of inspiration in videos and blog posts. Thank you for watching. The 4 things I'll be discussing today are size of your quilt project, the purpose of your quilt project, the quilting method that you're going to choose, and the budget that you have in mind for your quilt project. So let's get started. The first thing to consider when choosing a quilt backing is what size is your project. In most yardage that is sold in your typical quilt store or big box store, the yardage is a width of 40 inches, 40 to 44 inches or so. Anything larger than that, you will need to find alternate sized fabric for it. So think about whether your quilt project is small, like this one. This is a wall hanging that I did, or it's very large, like the one behind me. This is made for a twin size bed. If you decide that you want to use yardage, typical 40 to 44 inch yardage, then you'll want to choose that for small projects. Things like a wall hanging like this, table runners, placemats, anything like that. You can use yardage without having to piece it. However, for anything larger than about 40 inches or so, you're going to need to have additional yardage. And there's a couple of ways that you would have to do that. You would have to either buy large width yardage, which is typically 104 to 108 inches wide, or you could piece it using the smaller width yardage and put it in a couple different pieces, either horizontal seams, vertical seams, or a combination of both. Here's a quick diagram showing a 72 by 84 inch quilt top with an overlay showing the backing at 10 inches wider, 5 inches all the way around. The differences are in the wide back yardage. It's significantly less yards, but you will pay more per yard. Then I show the middle diagram is 44 inch yardage with vertical seams, a bit more yardage, about twice as much, and then 44 inch yardage using horizontal seams, which is significantly more. As you can see, the horizontal seamed yardage is up to 3 times as much in total yardage as the wide back yardage. Keep that in mind. So it depends partly on the size of your project, whether you're going to use just one whole piece of yardage in 40 inches, or you'll need to go larger or piece it. So the first thing is, what size is your quilt project? The second thing to look at when considering a quilt backing is, what is the purpose of your project? Is it decorative, meaning it's a wall hanging, or maybe it's a table runner, or something that won't get used very much, like it goes on a guest room bed, for example, or maybe it's an anniversary quilt that they put on for display, or only they put it out for special occasions. In this case, the project won't get washed very much at all or used in any significant amount. That may affect the type of backing that you choose and the price point, quite honestly. Third thing you'll want to consider is the quilting method. This is very important. Do you intend to sew it on your domestic sewing machine yourself? Or do you intend to hand quilt it, the entire thing? Or do you intend to hand tie it using yarn or other floss or something like that? Or do you intend to long arm it either on your own long arm machine or send it out to your favorite long arm quilter? Each of those things may make a difference in the backing that you choose. After you've thought about the size of your quilt project and the purpose of your quilt project, you want to talk with your long arm quilter if you're going to send it out to be long armed, or if you're doing it yourself, you'll need to think about how you're going to handle long arming your quilt. Some long arm quilters have specific requirements that they have, either in how much beyond the quilt itself that the yardage needs to go. Typically it's 4 or 5 inches on every side, on all sides. And some quilters, some long arm quilters do not allow horizontal seams across the back of their quilt. For example, Missouri Star Quilt Company, if you send your quilt to them, they typically list all their yardage with vertical seams. If you want to go a more economy route, you can do piecing of the yardage, but you'll want to check with your long arm quilter to make sure that is okay with them. If you're doing it yourself, of course, you can use whatever you want. If you're going to hand tie or hand quilt your project, you want to choose a more loosely woven fabric or a lighter weight. You would not want to use a denim fabric for the backing on your hand-tied or hand-quilted project. It would be very difficult to move your needle in and out. When you're looking at quilt backings, you'll definitely want to look at the price of these fabrics. Some fabrics are very inexpensive. For example, muslin and typical 44-inch yardage is not all that expensive. When you get to the higher end, linen, silk, high-end quilter's cotton, the price point is much higher. So you want to keep your budget in mind when you're choosing a quilt backing.
Here are a few cost-saving ideas. The obvious, of course, are shop the sales and use your coupons. Other ideas are to repurpose things you already have, such as bed sheets or curtains. Another idea, of course, is to shop the thrift stores. You can often find gently used or almost new items to use as well. Another thing would be to reuse or recycle what you have. For example, old jeans or old shirts cut up and pieced back together would make wonderful, durable backings. Another thing is to check with your guild, the free fabric swap table at your guild. And last but not least, check with your friends. You never know what they might have hiding in their closet they'd love to give to you. In the next section of this video, I'll cover more than a dozen fabric options for you, a few design tips to help with choosing the backing, and a couple of ideas about piecing your backing in case you don't want to do whole cloth or you want to use up some fabric you have on hand.
So the rest of this video will primarily talk about quilts where they are larger than 40 inches, and you'll need to either piece it in some way or you'll need to purchase large width yardage. So let's start with the typical backing for a quilt. The majority of quilters, generally speaking, probably use 40 to 45 inch width cotton, either just economy cotton they buy at their big box store, or that they buy in quilter's cotton off the bolt at their local quilt store or online. That works just fine. You'll just have to be aware that you'll have to piece it, and depending on the direction that you want your seams to go, more yardage may be required. If you're more frugal like me, I tend to piece mine where it has both vertical and horizontal seams. If the quilt is, say, for example, 75 by 80 or 65 by 80, then I typically will have a horizontal seam and a vertical seam. I've also sent my quilts out to be long-armed, and my long-arm quilter is just fine with that. It's not a problem at all. But check with yours on the direction and the number of seams that are allowed for long-arm quilting. Here's an example of a quilt that I did. It has a 16 patch design on the front, and then I just used some inexpensive novelty cotton at the 44-inch wide for the backing. Here's another example of an autumn quilt I did, and then I used inexpensive 44-inch yardage on the back, and it looks wonderful. After typical 40 to 44-inch wide yardage, the most likely used backing is our wide backs. That runs about 104 inches to 108 inches wide, and then you just buy the length you need, plus whatever you might need if you're sending out to long arm it. It is a little bit more expensive. Some places have coupons, whether it's a local quilt shop or a big box store, or even online. You might be able to get some wide back fabric cheaper. The big advantage, of course, for wide backs is that you don't have to piece it at all. Sometimes you're just done. You're at the end of your quilt project, your top is done, you just want to get that back on there and get it quilted and bound and off to its recipient. So in that case, you would probably want to choose the 108, which is what they typically call it, the 108 or the wide back fabric. That's quick and it's easy. Here's an example of a sampler quilt that I did. And then I had it professionally long-armed, and this is using your 108 wide quilter's cotton. It looks beautiful. But what if you don't want to spend that kind of money, or you want to piece your backing because you want to use up some leftovers, or you have some special things you want to incorporate into the back, or spending the money on the wide back is just not in your budget? What are some other options? One of the options that you can try is using a flat sheet. Now, there are some purists, aka quilt police, out there who say, oh, that's a rookie mistake. You should never use a sheet. I beg to differ, and I have used sheets on my quilts several times for my backing, and it has been no problem. They've been washed. It's not an issue at all. So I've used both new sheets and sheets that I've had laying around in my linen closet for quite a while. It's no problem at all. Here's an example of a backing to a quilt that I made, and it has a sheet for the background. I just did basic quilting myself, and it's worked out wonderfully. Now that I've covered the most common types of quilt backing that are used, which is quilter's cotton in either 44-inch wide, 108-inch wide, or a sheet, let's consider some other types of cotton and other materials. Another typical type of backing fabric would be your flannel. In this example is a wall hanging, and I've just used 44-inch wide inexpensive flannel, and it turned out great. Here's an example of a quilt that I made that has cottons on the front, quilting cottons on the front, and then this is a shirting fabric. It's actually flannel that I found in the shirting section of my local quilt store. So this would be an awesome backing for the right quilt. Another type of backing fabric would be batik. Can you use batiks on the backing of your quilt? Absolutely. In this case, I've used a beautiful turquoise batik on the back of my batik rail fence quilt. But you can mix and match the fabrics. It's no problem at all. You might want to throw in a color catcher or two in the wash just to catch any stray dye. But other than that, it should turn out great. After flannel, the next most used is probably fleece. Can you use fleece on a quilt backing? Absolutely. Here's an example where I have. This one has been well loved and well washed, and it works great. Very comfortable and snug. The next fabric I want to talk about is muslin. Some people say that you shouldn't use muslin at all. Well, I think it depends on what you're using the quilt for. Is it going to be utilitarian, or is it going to be decorative and no one will see it? Are you looking for a very inexpensive option, or are you looking for something a little bit better? Here's a quilt back where I've used muslin, but it's an upgraded muslin. So it's not as expensive as some of your quilting cotton, but it looks and feels just as good, and it was exactly what I was looking for, and it came in the width that I needed. What are some other fabrics you could use? Well, there's a whole wide world of them out there. Some other possibilities could be Cuddle, Minky Shannon, very soft and snuggly for a winter quilt. You could use corduroy perhaps for durability, or denim, especially if it's going to be a quilt you keep in the car for picnics and things like that. Using outdoors, you might consider that. Wool is another possibility depending on what you're using your quilt for and the look you're going for. A few more options of materials are satin, which would be the polyester satin, silk, real silk, you could use that as well. What about a polyester cotton blend? I would say it depends on the fabric and how well you feel it might hold up. Most quilters don't use that, but you might want to use that. It's whatever works for you. A couple of other options are linen. I've not used linen for my backing or my quilts, but I know quilters who have, and they think it turns out wonderfully. So if you use a good quality linen, it should be great. The last one I'm going to bring up is microfiber, especially if you try like a microfiber sheet. I personally have tried it and it would not hold up. It kept slipping when I tried to quilt it. The spray basting would not stick. I really got frustrated with it, and it was just too slippery of a material for the quilt that I was doing, because I was doing a bed-size quilt. Now maybe you could wrangle it if it were a wall hanging, but I personally don't recommend microfiber sheets for backing, although I have heard of quilters who have used it with success. So you try and see what works for you. I've got just a couple more things for you to think about when choosing your backing. One is, think about how the backing goes with the front of your quilt. In this particular case, I chose the backing which is very similar to the border, so I kept the look of the quilt very similar. It kind of blends together. You may or may not want that. For me, when I choose my quilt backing, I always try to make my quilts double-sided. What I mean by that is whatever I put on for the backing, I want it to look just as good as the front side so that I have two quilts in one, so to speak. Let's go back to this quilt for a moment. So in this case, you can see that the quilt itself is much different on the front than it is on the back, and yet it would look great on the bed on this side as well. I've chosen a complementary binding that matches both the front and the back, and it gives a seamless look to the quilt. I'd like to show you one more example. In this example, I've used some tulip pink fabrics on the front side of it, but I wanted something less geometric on the back, so I chose a bright floral from my local big box store and then edged it in a complementary binding. Had it professionally quilted. I think it looks great. And you can see that the look is totally different between the back and the front. My next tip is to choose the color or print that goes with the room decor of the recipient. In this example, I've chosen a small green print that goes well and complements both the quilt and her room decor. One last design tip is to choose a favorite color, hobby, or interest for the quilt backing. An example here is on my brother's Southwestern quilt. I chose dog bones and paw prints to represent his love of dogs. The last thing I want to talk about is piecing the backing. If you don't want to use the same yardage throughout the entire back, you might just want to use up yardage you have laying around, or you want to use up scraps like I did here. This is the scraps left from my quilt project, and I just pieced it into a pleasing shape for me and sewed it together. So it looks great, it's decorative, I can use the quilt wall hanging on either side, and I've used up my scraps, so it's a win all the way around. Keep that in mind as well. You don't have to go out and buy more material for backing. You might be able to piece a backing with what you've got on hand, either scraps left from the current project or from other yardage and scraps you have in your stash. So check there as well. And there you have it. Considerations for choosing your quilt backing. Don't forget to check the size of your project, the purpose of your project, the quilting method you're going to use, and your budget when deciding what quilt backing to buy or to use. Don't forget to check your stash as well. Please leave a note for me in the comments and tell me what's your favorite quilt backing to use, or what's the most unusual quilt backing that you've used. I'd love to hear from you. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up, tell a friend, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Don't forget to head on over to my blog at DKohnDesigns.com. There you'll find free patterns and lots of inspiration. Please join me again next week. See you next time.